بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد نبي الرحمة وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our look at the absolute essentials, we are completing the section on purification today and then beginning with the conditions and integrals of prayer. So we saw in the previous lesson what the obligatory actions of wudu and the description of the wudu is. So just to recap, what are the 4 obligatory acts of wudu? Okay. Those are parts of the body. Yeah, good. Washing the face, arms up to the elbows, wiping a quarter of the head, and washing the feet up to and including the ankles. And why are they just 4 obligatory acts of wudu and not more? Yeah, because of the Quranic verse in the 5th surah, verse 6. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us, "O you believe, if you stand to pray, then do these actions," right? Wash your faces, your arms up to the elbows, wipe your heads, and your feet up to the ankles. So the implication of the verse is that if you do these, it is sufficient for you now to pray. Okay? And the intention, why is that not obligatory? Why is the intention not obligatory? One, because it's not mentioned in the verse. Another, and so water is purifying in itself. So why isn't intention necessary? That's a part of a logical statement, but okay, so because the purpose of wudu is to be in a state of purity, and water is by itself purifying, so it was sufficient. That's a secondary. That's in law that would be considered a supporting argument. It's not a central argument. Another central argument would be that purification is merely what kind of act of worship? Yeah, it's a condition, right? It's a condition for the deliberate act of worship. The deliberate act of worship, or the act of worship that is in itself sought there, is the prayer or recitation of Quran or whatever else you make wudu for. And conditions simply have to be fulfilled. They don't have to be sought. Of course, an interesting thing arises, and just to, since we're trying to appreciate some of the nuances of knowledge, technically, the hadith of intention is not proof. The hadith of intention that the Prophet ﷺ said, actions are by their intentions, and each person shall have whatsoever they sought. This is not a decisive proof. Why? Because what kind of text is it? It's a sahih hadith. But there's another consideration, that how strong is that hadith in the meaning it affirms, and how the meaning has come to us. It's a hadith that is non-decisive, right? It's dhanni, because it has come to us with authentic chain of transmission, but it's not decisive. It's not decisive. It's a singular hadith. Right? So we affirm it, but not decisively. But then there's another step, that the meaning of the hadith is also not decisive. Because it says actions are by their intentions. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بالنيات. الأعمال, which is the mubtada, right? That's a mubtada. Where's the khabar? Right? There's actions are something by their intentions. And that something is implicit. Actions are something by their intentions. That something that is implicit, in Arabic they call this taqdeer. You have to, for the sentence to be complete, you have to affirm something that is implicit. When you affirm something that's implicit, that's not decisive. Because there's more than one possibility. Right? So what do you affirm? And then it's a matter actually of difference of opinion. What do you affirm? Do you affirm that actions are valid by their intentions? Or do you say actions are rewarded by their intentions? Actions are completed by their intentions. So in the Hanafi school, when they say at-taqdeeru min bab al-darura, when something's implicit, this is a type of necessity. So you affirm the least. Right? So you wouldn't say actions are valid by their intentions, but actions are rewarded by their intentions. For example, there's other texts that are stronger than that in terms of the necessity of intention, such as from Surah Al-Bayyinah, verse 5. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They've only been commanded that they worship Allah, making their religion sincere unto Him. So do you not have to intend in wudu? Like intention is just simply optional? Is intention just optional in wudu? So it's like she's the official representative for the sisters? Okay, go ahead. It's an emphasized sunnah. Right? So just because it's not obligatory doesn't mean it's not important. It's an emphasized sunnah. So not making the intention would be performing a wudu contrary to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, number one. Number two, what else happens if you don't have an intention? There's loss of reward. But is it knowable that you could make wudu and not have intention? No. Right? The basis is that any deliberate human action was intended. So if you're making wudu and you doubt, oh my goodness, I didn't make intention, well, what were you just doing? Making wudu. So you intended it. And the sign of the intention that you know in your heart what it is that you're doing. And normally if you do something that's specific, in a specific way, you intended it. Why did you go to the washroom? To make wudu. That's the intention, right? So when you have doubts about the intention, you ignore them. Unless it's clear. What would be intention? You're just going to work to decide to brush your teeth. And you had no thought of making wudu. Then you decided to wash your cheek because you have some almond powder on your almond butter croissant or whatever. Then you decided to wash your face. Then you said, let me make wudu. That's the kind of situation where if where it would be best to start again and make an intention. Because what you were doing to begin with wasn't wudu. That's not why you were in the washroom, etc. But let's say you took a shower and came out and then decided, I'd like to pray. Can you pray? Assuming that the parts of the body that wudu relates to got washed, face, arms, a little of the head, the feet, which normally would happen in the shower. Then after the shower you would have wudu. But would you have reward for that wudu? No. Not directly anyways. Of course, the fuqaha, when they talk about reward and punishment, they're talking about what is entailed legally, right, in accordance with divine justice. Because when you seek, you try to act in accordance with justice and then you rely on divine mercy. Because otherwise, we'd all be slackers. So today we're going to begin by looking at what nullifies ritual ablution, what nullifies wudu. We talked about this briefly, that there's two types of things that break wudu. There's the things that actually break wudu, and there's things that effectively break wudu. Because in the Hanafi school, they said that if you look at the things that require wudu, there's a shared meaning, which is the exiting of filth. The exiting of filth. And this is indicated by a number of Quranic texts, amongst them the verse of purification, that if one of you comes from the toilet, right, and you don't find water, etc., then make wudu. So what requires then make tayammum. So what requires wudu is you don't go to the toilet for fun. You go to the toilet to relieve yourself. Right? So it's the exiting of filth. There's a number of other texts as well. So from that, and even the state that requires wudu is called hadath, which is something happening. Right? Something happening refers to the exiting, specifically exiting of something from the private parts, right? So from that, they took that, and then you look at the things that from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that clearly require wudu, all of them share in this meaning. And there's others in which the texts aren't clear, and those, such as touching one's private parts, for example, or touching someone of the opposite sex, that some texts would appear to indicate that you require wudu, and some others that you don't. So it's understood there, either linguistic meaning, that you simply wudu, what's the linguistic meaning? Cleaning oneself, right? Wudu has a sense of cleanliness or radiance. So cleaning oneself. So what are you cleaning here? Your hands. Wudu is also used linguistically for basic cleanliness, washing hands. Or it's out of recommendation. So that's why certain things that you may have heard that require wudu in the Hanafi schools, those aren't, such as touching the private parts, or because there's no meaning there of exiting of filth. But then what about sleep and the like? How is these effective nullifiers? It's not the thing itself that requires wudu, but what ما لا يخلو هذا الحال عنه, that which is inevitably found in this state, which is the exiting of filth. The exiting of filth. That, if you go to sleep, your limbs relax, so gas would very often come out. Right? Same thing happens if you have loss of sanity or drunkenness, etc. So that's why there's two types of nullifiers. Let's look at these one by one. So what nullifies wudu? The legal cause of wudu is the exiting of filth. Right? The exiting of filth. So the first nullifier is the exiting of filth or air from the private parts. Now, why does gas break wudu? Because is gas filthy? Sometimes common people come to deep yet flawed conclusions. Jordan, there's some repeated questions that I'd be asked. One of the interesting questions that'd be asked repeatedly there is that if my undergarments were wet and I passed gas, then are my private parts now filthy? And the conclusion that if passing wind breaks wudu, then it must be filthy. So if that filthy air came in contact with my wet I don't know why people's underwear would be wet. I don't know, extra sweating or something, then is my underwear filthy, and therefore are my private parts filthy? Therefore, can I not pray? So of course, the simple answer is gas filthy? Is gas filthy? No. Okay. Then why does it break wudu? Because it passes through a filthy area. So it takes off that ruling. But gas itself is not filthy. So if someone did have wet underwear and some air came out of their private parts, it does not make your underwear filthy, to whom it may concern. So, but the exiting of filth from the private parts, right, front or rear. With respect to the private parts, it's if the filth appears at the point of exiting. So if it exiting, it's the mere exiting of the filth that breaks from other than the private parts, such as a wound, for example. If blood or pus exits from any other part of the body, the condition for it to break wudu is that it flows. That it flows. What is flowing? Flowing is that it exits, it appears on the outside, and it moves beyond the point of exiting. It moves beyond or would have moved if, upon exiting, it had not been prevented from moving, such as by wiping it away or soaking it. If someone's bleeding, you could put a cotton swab and just keep soaking up the blood, so it appears on the surface, but it got soaked up, so it didn't flow. The fuqaha will say it did effectively, because they define flowing as appearing on the surface of the body with sufficient force for it to have exited had it not been prevented. Right? So that's if you wiped it away or soaked it up. So practically, why is this significant? Because let's say you got a paper cut. Not easy to demonstrate, but you got a paper cut. Don't worry, I'm not going to self-inflict harm on myself. But okay, so you got a paper cut. Actually, the pen's not working, so it's almost wounding myself to do this. So, of course, not good manners to throw a pen, so I won't. So you got a paper cut, right? So blood appeared on the surface. Does that break wudu? No. Why? Because it exited, but it did not flow. Right? It did not flow. So that blood, number one, doesn't break wudu. Number two, and this is a side detail, anything that does not break wudu is not filthy. Anything that does not break wudu, if it were to come out of a human being, is filthy. Right? Because some fuqaha defined it in the principle in this way: anything that does not break wudu is not filthy. So they said, so you're telling me that if a dog vomited on you, that dog vomit is not filthy? So that's why the expressions in the texts of the scholars are very precise, because I had hundreds of years of legal wrangling over them. So they're very precise. Sometimes they actually sound a little awkward, because they've argued about them for so long. Right? So they're defensive statements. Right? Because there's all kinds of things that they avoid. But if you have a paper cut, what was the condition for filth, for something coming out to break wudu from other than the private parts? It has to flow. So if it simply appeared on the surface, it did not flow, so it doesn't break wudu. And there's a principle, anything that does not break wudu is not filthy. So then let's say you got a paper cut, and then somehow you're trying to figure out what to do with it, and your sleeve gets in touch with that paper cut. So there's a trail of blood. Let's say you got a really long paper cut. Somehow. Right? Because let's say you have a friend who's a primary school teacher. She's become an expert at paper cuts. So she said, I'll show you how to get a paper cut. She showed you. She got like a really long paper cut. And then you didn't realize it till you put on your shirt. Two separate incidents. You got a long paper cut, then you put on your shirt, and now there's a trail of blood on your shirt. Is that filthy? And Fajr time's almost out, so you need to pray. You got a trail of paper cut. Does that constitute flow? Right? So two questions asked. Now, did it come out with the force? Did it actually flow? No. Did it come out with such strength that left on its own it would have flowed? No. So it does not break wudu, number one. So you could pray like that. Number two, is that now considered filthy? No. So blood on your shirt, for example, or clothing is not necessarily filthy. Why? Because if it's a small amount, how do you know it flowed or not? What do? You don't know if it flowed or not. So what do? There's a really important principle to keep in mind, that they say إِذَا تَعَذَّرَ الْيَقِينُ يُصَارُ إِلَى الظَّنِّ. When certainty is not possible, arises one's reasoned judgment. And that's part of the mercy of our deen, that you don't have to be certain about everything. Right? That when certainty is not possible, reasoned judgment is sufficient. It's from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the closing two verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, which are, as an aside, one should always recite these two verses before going to sleep. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever recites these two verses at night, they'll be sufficient for them. He didn't say they'll be sufficient for what. And the Prophet ﷺ received a lot of revelation, 23 years of revelation coming down upon him. But when these two verses were revealed, he was exceedingly happy. It says, today, two verses were revealed to me, the like of which are not found in any previous revelation. And they're the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, beginning with آمن الرسول. And in there's an important statement. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not make a soul responsible for more than it is able. So part of that, so when you're able to be certain, you act on certainty. But when you're not, what do? When you're not able to be certain, you use it. So now, if you see blood on your shirt, you don't know whether it flowed or not. But you didn't see it. So what do? You make your judgment. Does it appear to have flowed or not? And if it's a lot, it'd be probably obvious that it flowed. But if it's a little, what would you assume? When it comes to matters of purity, you assume validity. You assume that if there is some filth, for example, that it is a little and not a lot. So you assume validity and you affirm the minimum. So would you assume that it broke wudu or not? the initial assumption would be that it did not break wudu. So you see some blood on your shirt, right? Like a dot of blood or a little circle of blood. The assumption would be that it did not break wudu unless you are reasonably sure that it did. Right? So you have to be, it's not this, that am I sure that it didn't break wudu? The assumption is that your wudu is valid. When in doubt, you assume validity. Right? So of course, if it's clear, you got a big patch of blood, you're certain that it. But when you're not certain, you begin with the assumption of validity, of soundness, and if there is filth, you would assume that there's a little. But you're not sure if it's even filthy, because you're not sure it's flowed. Assumption would be it didn't flow, unless you're sure to the contrary. And we look at the principles of certainty and doubt. And this happens very often if you have scabs or wounds, and they open up, there's a dot of blood that appears, for example. That dot of blood, does it break wudu? No, because it didn't flow. Okay. So that's the flowing of blood. And pus, if it flows out, it breaks wudu. If it just appears, it doesn't. Then, so the Quran actually talks about of the things that are filthy, أو دما مسفوحا. مسفوح أي سائلا, or blood that flows. Ask the question, what about blood? How could a lot of blood come out of your body without flowing? How could a lot of blood come out of your body without? The injection. Injections aren't something new. So the blood didn't come out of the body, it was taken out. Not for fun, there's conceivable reason, it was taken out. So, so the principle is al-khariju wal-mukhraju sawa'. That which comes out by itself, made to come out, is the same in this ruling. And that's a stronger position. So you've got an injection at the hospital, for example, it would break your wudu too if the blood was taken out. However, and this is a useful thing to note, especially if you're dealing with elder family members, etc., that there is a strong opinion in the Hanafi school that which is taken out does not break wudu. It's a weaker opinion, but it has. I had one of the greatest experiences of my life was one of the senior-most Hanafi jurists, one of the senior-most scholars alive. He came to Jordan and he fell ill. And I was so happy because he came for a conference. We were hoping to catch him in moments of the conference, but he was bedridden for several days. So a friend and I, we sort of camped out with him. There's man, like it or not, I'm your guest. So until we'd get there first thing in the morning to make sure he had breakfast, and we stay with him till night for 4 days, and bombarded him with questions, asked him several hundred questions. And there's no shyness when you're seeking benefit. So until he said, actually I heard it many times. I said, okay, I'll apologize later, right? Because training, bring out all the buckets, right? So, but a few times, when he was really tired, and until he was clearly very tired, we'd assume, I went with the assumption of validity, that he is fine with me asking questions unless he tells me not to, or he's obviously not in a state to answer questions. When in doubt, assume validity, right? So I applied that principle. My friend was like, let him rest. I said, sometimes, benefit trumps adab, right? So sometimes he'd raise his hand like he's dozing off. He said, Jawabul alili alil. That the alil, the one who's, the answer of the one unsound is unsound. Okay? I'm not, like I'm dozing off right now. But he had to be taken to hospital. So actually, one of the princes in Jordan, who's a religious man, who actually exhibited more, as he came, knocked on the door, the Shaykh was unwell, so he went away. And he just came on his own. He's a senior prince. He's a good man, actually. So he sent a royal, like a military ambulance, because also has a senior station in the Jordan. So they went to the ambulance. So actually, even in the ambulance, when he's on the stretcher, I was asked a bunch of questions. Alhamdulillah. We got to the hospital, and it was right before Maghrib. Like we got there, Maghrib Adhan. It was a bit of an emergency because some soldiers had been in an accident. Most soldiers die of self-inflicted harms, whether they commit suicide in the world. Like if you see actually how do soldiers die, it's kind of bizarre. A lot of them die in military exercises, car crashes, in training. Makes you wonder about the whole enterprise, right? So at the military hospital. So the Shaykh into the room. Military hospital, so they weren't high on subtlety, right? They lay him down. First thing they did, because they'd been asking him questions between my questions in the ambulance, so they took some blood. As soon as the adhan had gone, this is right after the adhan, so the adhan was Maghrib. Yeah. So, and then they put in an IV. No questions that we're going to do this, is it okay? Just put in an IV. And IVs take some time. I was really excited because there's a lot of fiqh issues that came up. One was that he was weak. Number two, he's got all this stuff on him. So I said, I guess I have to take the position that I still have wudu, right? Because he got the IV. Of course, other issues arose. He actually took a dispensation from another school because he was still stuck to the IV. They said you need it. So he said, you go and pray because you don't have an excuse to combine. I'll take the Shafi'i position and pray at the hospital. Pray when we get back to the hotel. So, but sometimes knowing these other positions is helpful. So the stronger opinion is that even if it was made to come out, so if you have a wound and you squeezed hard and drew blood out of it, the main position will be it breaks your wudu. But particularly in situations of difficulty, right? Like someone had to draw blood, they're in hospital now, it'll be hard to make wudu, etc. There's another opinion. This also, one of the other reasons I mentioned this is that there's an important principle that the general, not something affirmed generally is not necessarily affirmed absolutely. The difference between the general and the absolute. The general applies to general cases, but there can be exceptions. In logic, they use the example. They say, there's a difference between saying Ahlul Azhar ulama and saying Kullu Azhariyin alim. The difference between saying the people of Azhar are scholars and saying every Azhari is a scholar. Because the second is an absolute, the first is a general statement, the people of Azhar are scholars. The second is to say every Azhari is a scholar. A general statement does not apply to every particular, necessarily. Imam al-Damanhuri says in his commentary on the Sulam, وَفِيهِمْ مَنْ لَمْ يَشُمَّ رَائِحَةَ الْعِلْمِ, because amongst them are those who haven't even smelt the whiff of knowledge. And he was Azhari himself, right? And this is like 200 years ago, in the glory days of Al-Azhar. So similarly, a general ruling, right, applies generally, but there may be exceptions. When the application of a particular ruling in your particular case would appear to, particularly if it appears to entail unusual hardship, find out whether there is another opinion. And in general, we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. He has placed no hardship for you in matters of religion. So there are We just use one example. There's many other dispensations like this that arise. Even within the school, whether it be a dispensation, sometimes there will be an exception made in exceptional circumstances. You can't make up things as you go along, but this is why it's important to ask. It's important to ask. So, blood that was made to come out, there is an opinion that makes an exception for that. Vomiting a mouthful also breaks wudu. Unless it's just phlegm. Right? It would be unusual that you vomit a mouthful of phlegm, but it's conceivable. Right? Usually the scholars mention things like this either because it came up or because they're asked about it, so they reasoned it out. But vomiting a mouthful. And sorry to be graphic about it, but vomiting a mouthful breaks wudu if the vomit, like what if you vomited multiple times? So they say what counts for a mouthful is ittihadu sabab la ittihadu al-makan. It's the same cause, not that you're in the same place. So if you sat and you vomited over 15 minutes and there's a pile of vomit, it doesn't, if no single act of vomiting was more than a mouthful, it wouldn't break your wudu. Right? What counts is the same, what in Arabic they call al-ghathayan, right? The same vomiting motion. Right? The same vomiting motion. Right? So you vomited, but it all became vomiting motion, that's considered together. Even if it's not in the same place. So you try to run to the washroom, so you left a trail of vomit, no single vomit is more than a mouthful. It doesn't matter where you vomited, it matters why you vomited. Is it from the same vomiting motion? That would be considered a mouthful. What if you're not sure it's a mouthful? What if you're not sure it's a mouthful? Then what happens? What do you assume? You assume purity, but that's the secondary matter. First thing, do you assume it's a mouthful or not? Not. You affirm the least. Right? So if you're not sure if it's a little or a lot, you assume it's only a little. So vomit, if it's not a mouthful, is it najis? Is it filthy? No. Because what's the principle? Yeah, whatever doesn't break wudu is not filthy. Of course, not everything that is not filthy, not everything that is pure is permissible to eat. Right? So just for your information, right? So you could have pure vomit, but pure does not mean it's wholesome or edible, right? It's not, there's the category of thing that's considered mustaqdar. Mustaqdar meaning that's considered to be vile, right? Detestable. Right? That normal temperaments would consider detestable. And those things are not permitted to consume either. They may not be filthy. So if you got that paper cut of blood, you can't lick it up and swallow it. Right? You can't do that. I mean, you could lick it up and spit it out, but the act of licking it up would not be considered proper. Okay? They say, can you lick a wound? The way to lick a wound, they said, is you moisten a finger and you lick it that way, and then you wash your fingers. You don't lick with your tongue. Right? Just those who wish to lick indirectly, right? If you want to wipe away blood. But if you vomit that's less than a mouthful, does not break wudu and therefore is not filthy. What if a child vomits on you? Whose mouthful is considered? Whose mouthful is considered? The child's, right? The child's. Now, how do you know? Do you know how big the child's mouth is? So you're taking care of your neighbor's daughter, and the neighbor's daughter vomits on you. Now, sometimes it's obvious, right? So we're not talking about the obvious case. It's like, how did she generate that much vomit? That's obvious. That's like a stomach full, right? So that's obvious. We're talking about the borderline case. You're not sure. What would the initial assumption be? Is it a mouthful or not? That it's not a mouthful. When it comes to matters of purification and purity, you always assume the least. Number one, you always assume the least. Right? Then, let's say it's a mouthful. Does a mouthful of vomit from the baby break your wudu? No. It is only, the vomiting of a mouthful breaks the wudu of the person who vomited. Right? Just to be clear, some people get nervous. Of course, one way of scaring someone is, I scared a family member about this because they're asking me questions related to baby stuff. So I said, okay, so I framed them. I said, okay, what are the things that break wudu? What's the first thing that breaks wudu? I said, exiting of filth. I said, and then basically God didn't say that, and anything that exits from other than private parts. So what happens when you're nursing? The person started crying. So, oh my God. It's not everything that exits from other than the private parts, right? It's the exiting of filth from other than the private parts, right? Because, for example, if someone's nursing, that's not the exiting of filth, right? Milk is not filthy by Quranic text, right? So that doesn't break to whom it maketh. There are actually, surprisingly, many women who've studied fiqh start thinking that maybe nursing breaks wudu, and nursing does not break wudu. Right? Because it's the exit, the flowing of blood or pus, meaning the flowing of that which would be considered, that can be considered filthy. Right? Which is, blood, excrement doesn't come out from other private blood or pus or some other some other impurity. Right? But tears, mucus, milk does not, it's not the exiting of filth. Eating a mouthful of other. Any questions here before we look at sleep? Go ahead.
So if the baby vomits a mouthful on, let's say, mom or dad, sure it's a mouthful, does that nullify wudu of their mom and dad?
No. Vomiting breaks wudu of the person who vomited. Okay? So if the child had wudu, then a question would arise, do you make wudu again for the child, right? But little children are not expected to be in a state of wudu, right? But it doesn't affect the parents' wudu in any way. Right? Likewise, handling filth does not affect wudu at all. So let's say you're walking, not you, let's say Zubair's walking to the masjid, but he's lost in thoughts of Zubaydah. Right? And he falls, and there's a natural living movement in the suburb he lives in. So someone brought their horse to the masjid. But the horse didn't want to enter the masjid, so it expressed its disapproval just outside the masjid. But like mu'addab, it's good adab. It expressed its disapproval outside the masjid compound, not inside. But Zubayr tripped and fell into that expression of disapproval. Right? So he got all this filth on him. Does that break his wudu? So he wants to go and pray. What does he have to do? He just has to rid himself of the filth. Getting in contact with filth, even if a lot. Right? The horse was fed organic vegetables or something, wasn't used to them because it grew up eating synthetics. So it got diarrhea. So he's like sloshing in filth. All he has to do is is to wash away the filth. And if there's still a bad smell, you pray away from the congregation, of course. But does not require repeating wudu. Does not require repeating wudu. Right? Handling filth, his diaper, does not break wudu. Right? Because what breaks wudu? The things that are mentioned here and nothing else. And nothing else. So, just to recap, the exiting of filth from other than the private parts, the mere exiting of it, meaning appearing on the surface, breaks wudu. From other than the private parts, it has to exit and flow, actually or effectively, as we saw. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Sometimes when hair falls out, it has like maybe a piece of skin or something at the end of it. Is that considered filthy?
Okay. So, the end, like if hair is plucked out, the little ball of fat at the end, the fuqaha describe it as fat. I don't know what's called in English. Whatever that that little thing is at the end of hair. What's it called? Anyone know science here? What? Whatever. Something lickle. Yeah, follicle? Whatever it is, that little blob at the end, technically that would be filthy. Right? Now let's say your wife's driving you crazy, or your husband. So you grabbed your hair and you're praying, you see several of them on you. That amount of filth would be excusable. But is that flowing filth? No. So it doesn't affect your wudu, unless you started bleeding too, right? Doesn't affect wudu in any way. Now, sleep. The Prophet ﷺ, amazing thing about the Prophet ﷺ is, he spoke in such amazingly beautiful ways. So he wanted to tell us basically that when you sleep, you relax so gas will come out. Right? But he put it in such a beautiful way. He said, Al-aynani wika'u sah. Right? He said, the eyes are like what ties down a sack. Right? Like you have a leather sack, like they put water in, for example, or milk even. Right? And they'll be tied down by a rope. العينان وكاء السهم فإذا نامتا انطلق السهم. Says, so the eyes are like what ties down, what seals a sack. When the eyes sleep, the sack opens up. Meaning that your limbs relax, so therefore, what's going to happen? Gas is likely to come out. Okay. So that's the underlying reasoning. Which is why they say that don't pray right behind someone who's just. One, because they'll be restless and they may distract you, but also it's not uncommon when someone falls asleep for gas to come out. Right? So, it might distract you in prayer. So that's the reasoning. But then, with respect to sleep, there's two conditions. Right? The first is if your rear is seated, right? If your rear, and the rear is defined, the rear is the point of exit. It's not your whole backside, right? Someone told me once that I sleep lying down, my rear is seated. I had to tell him, well, unless you're built differently from the rest of us, your rear is not seated, my dear friend, right? Because by rear, they mean here where the gas would come out from, right? Okay? That is seated, right? And if you're lying down, it ain't seated, right? And seated refers to any direct contact it has with a surface. Right? So whether you're sitting on a chair or you're sitting on the ground, even if you're leaning and reclining, as long as your rear is not off the ground. Right? If you go to sleep seated, even reclining against something, it does not. If you go to sleep with your rear not seated, then this is what breaks wudu. So it's a trick question. Does sleep break wudu? It depends, right? It depends. And that's why sometimes what the ulama have this, they do this, but they usually do it gracefully. They'll get into a conversation, someone says, well, yeah, I'm studying these days. They'll ask a general, this kind of question. So, does sleep break wudu? Say, yeah. And then they'll continue talking, but they'll make a mental note. Dude doesn't know what they're talking about, right? So they won't get into any serious conversation, right? Because if you don't know that, if you're going to say that sleep breaks wudu, means you don't know the basics of fiqh. If you don't know the basics of fiqh, why get into deeper matters, right? And they'll usually do it subtly, so you won't realize that they just tested you out. Which is why they said that if you sit with the eloquent, guard your speech, right? Right? When you sit with the scholars, be careful of. Guard your speech and make sure you're speaking in an eloquent way. If you sit with the scholars, be careful of your words because they'll judge you for your words, right? Said, and if you sit with the righteous, guard your heart, right? Because they recognize pure states and impure states. Said, but if you sit with the people of Allah, sit as you wish, because they're with Him and not with you, right? And that's why one of the adab of being with ulama is to speak less and let them speak more, right? Though very often they'll let you speak a lot, and which will probably cause them distress as well, because you'll end up saying a lot of foolish things. So, if your rear is not seated, it does not. If your rear is not seated, it nullifies wudu, right? So if you're lying down, or you're reclining, such that your rear is off the ground. When you're and you realize you're sleeping turbulently, so you're twisting and turning. As long as you're reasonably sure that you didn't actually fall over completely and stay like hell, then it doesn't break wudu. So your younger brother was driving you to Montreal, but you guys made a challenge, can we get to Montreal without taking a highway? So your brother said, okay, let's do it. But he started getting restless, so he's driving a bit crazy. You fell asleep, so you're tossing and turning. As long as you don't remember falling over completely and remaining falled over, then it does not nullify your wudu. Again, when in doubt, you assume validity and soundness. What about drowsiness? Drowsiness is considered sleep when it is deep. Light drowsiness is like being awake. Deep drowsiness is like being asleep. What's the distinguisher between light drowsiness and deep drowsiness? It is that in light drowsiness, you are aware of most of what's happening around you. And that's considered as if you're awake, so it doesn't break wudu. Deep drowsiness is when you can't catch most of what's going on around you. And that breaks wudu. But when would deep drowsiness break wudu? When would deep drowsiness break wudu? Yeah, if you're in deep drowsiness in a state in which sleep would have broken wudu. So you're deeply drowsy but sitting down, doesn't matter. So you say, I was drowsy while waiting for Fajr. Well, were you sitting down or were you lying down? If you're lying down, then deep drowsiness would break wudu. But if you're sitting down, it wouldn't. Had you fallen asleep, it wouldn't have broken your wudu. Swaying side to side doesn't affect it. With deep drowsiness, be careful. With drowsiness in general, be careful, because it's very possible to fall asleep, but you don't realize it. But what are you responsible for? So your own judgment, do you think it was deep drowsiness or not? A very practical thing to avoid doubts is that when you have to make a judgment, was it deep drowsiness or not? How many choices do you have? How many choices do you have? 2. Was it deep drowsiness or was it not deep drowsiness? And you're only responsible for your reasoned judgment of these 2 choices. There's a third choice that you should not entertain when making the choice, nor after making the choice, which is, I don't know. Because you can't do anything with I don't know. Because the premise is you don't know, but you need to make a judgment. So you make a judgment, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not hold you accountable for the truth. He'll only hold you for the consequence of your honest judgment. And that applies to because that's a principle. One of the there's numerous central religious principles highlighted in the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah. The 2 closing verses. One of them is this: make a soul responsible for more than it is able. So you don't know with certainty whether that drowsiness was light or heavy. So you're only responsible for your ability, which is to make a reasoned judgment. And if you make that and it was erroneous, you're not held responsible for that. You will not be punished for that. It won't be held that, well, you fell asleep with deep drowsiness, therefore you didn't have wudu, therefore that prayer was not valid. You're held accountable for your judgment. That's one. Related to that as well is that once you've made a judgment, you do not go back on it. Right? So let's say you thought the drowsiness was light. So you say, I still have wudu. So you go to the masjid, then you say, oh, what if it was heavy? Should you make wudu then? No. They say, al-ijtihadu la yunqadu bimithlihi. One judgment is not nullified by another. So you made a judgment. Once you make a judgment, then you don't go back on it. Unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. And you don't have any evidence. It was just mere judgment to begin with. So you don't go back on that. You don't go back on that. And that applies in general in life, that once you make a judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Once you resolve, then place your trust in Allah. And you don't second guess. Second guessing is contrary to the sunnah. It is not caution. Second guessing, once you've made a decision, going back on it, just out of doubts, is against the sunnah. And it applies in these kinds of situations. Once you make a judgment, you move on and you don't go back on it. And then there's a number of more rare cases, which is loss of consciousness. So Zubayr was thinking about Zubaydah after washing away the horse stuff, and he didn't notice that the corridor ended and there was a door on the left. So he walked right into the wall and he lost consciousness. Poor guy. Right? So loss of consciousness, once you regain consciousness, you're expected to make wudu. It's like sleep. Loss of intellect. Right? So, loss of intellect, which is not a funny matter, but loss of intellect, meaning that you lost your... Some people have situations where they have health condition, so they lose their sanity. Okay? And not just they act strange, but the actual loss of sanity. In that situation, when they regain their sanity, they need to make wudu. But if they're not sure if that is that loss of sanity, they should consult. Okay? And there's people like that, who may have temporary loss of sanity, or sometimes it can last a while, and there's rules related to that. If someone's affected by that, and as an aside, one of the things, someone who does not have basic capacity, basic rational capacity, right? They're not only not morally responsible, But such a person, the Prophet ﷺ tells us, رُفِعَ الْقَلَمُ عَنْ ثَلَاثٍ. The pen is lifted from three. Such people, if you see someone who is, does not have sanity, full sanity, they have some mental disability, such a person, you're seeing a person of paradise. Right? So you have to deal with them with that respect. Such a person is not held responsible for their actions. Even if, and you may have such a person in your family, they say you have to deal with such people with the utmost of gentleness and respect. Right? Gentleness and respect. Right? And to see them as a blessing, whatever circle of association they may be in. Because such a person is a person of paradise. And the same thing applies to children. Children, while they're children, are the people of paradise. Right? So you have to deal with them accordingly. And there's a number of such people around the Prophet ﷺ. He dealt with them with the greatest of honor. And others who had different disabilities. Right? There was one who had a skin condition. It was quite possibly a type of leprosy. So and it's not actually decisively established where he lived, but it would appear that he lived outside Medina. But when the Prophet ﷺ was encouraged to take a ring, which he did because of considerations related to non-Muslims. They said they'll be more likely to accept your letters if you seal them. So who was the keeper of the seal of the Prophet ﷺ? It was a person with disabilities. Okay? It was actually rejected in society, kind of like before that. Right? Because because of his skin condition. And so the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell him, come and live. He lived where he lived, but the Prophet ﷺ honored him and showed how you deal with people who have such challenges. And he was the keeper of the ring of the Prophet ﷺ, and after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it went to Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and he continued to be the keeper of the ring. So whenever the ring was needed, he would be called upon and would give the ring. And of course, then when was the ring lost? During the time of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. It fell into the well during the exchange, and that's when the fitna began. Right? So those are rare cases. Drunkenness. Someone gets drunk. When they come out of drunkenness, then they need to make wudu before they pray. Again, because that's a state where one loses a state of actual drunkenness. When one comes out of it, one needs to make wudu because one loses control of one's functions in that state. The eighth, laughing out loud in prayer. And laughing out loud is when it's audible. When it's audible to others. So laughter has three levels. Right? Merely smiling, right? So you wanted to laugh, but you just smiled, doesn't affect anything. It's better to avoid in the prayer, but you smiled, doesn't have any legal consequence. You could actually laugh, and laughter is that which مَا لَهُ صَوْت, right? It has sound. So you made a sound. If it was quiet, which is such that only you could hear it, that would break your prayer. As we'll see when we look at prayer, laughter, when it has a sound audible only to yourself, it breaks the prayer, but does not affect your wudu. But if you laughed out loud, such that another could hear it, then it would break your wudu as well. If something embarrassing is about to happen to you, right? It's better to go away from the situation than to cause disturbance to others, right? So we had this case. There's some in university, some sister in the sister's section apparently had stuffed a whole bunch of coins because they're something for some collection in some pocket on her. So every time she went from one position to another, the coins fell, and every time that happened, someone would laugh out loud. So we started like with 15, 20 people. We ended with 5 people praying. Right? My prayer only lasted because I was biting down on my lips. I heard from Shaykh Talal that that's one thing you can do. Right? So if something embarrassing is happening to you, right? Whatever it may be, causing distraction to others is very bad. So the sister in question, she didn't laugh because she was upset, right? But there, you break your prayer, remove the coins, and then get back into the prayer, right? That's praying, laughing out loud. Now, this is a ruling that's unique in the Hanafi school. Laughter, audible laughter, breaks the vast majority of Islamic scholarship. In the Hanafi school, laughing out loud is considered to break your wudu as well, because there's hadiths about that, but the hadiths are of a type of hadith called a mursal hadith. And a mursal hadith is a hadith in which there is an affirmed jump in the chain. An affirmed jump in the chain. The jump in the chain in question here is one of the tabi'een, one of the successors, the generation after the Prophet ﷺ, affirms that the Prophet ﷺ said such and such. So it's mursal. There's a jump in the chain. The Hanafis and Malikis accept such texts. Right? The Shafi'is don't. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal had an intermediate position on that, but generally inclined towards the position of his teacher, Imam al-Shafi'i. The Hanafis and Malik would say that's because Imam Abu Hanifa came 70 years before Imam al-Shafi'i. One was born in the year 80, the other born in the year 150. Malik was also born within the first century. So they're dealing with shorter chains. So anyways, there's mursal hadith that are sound if you keep in mind the fact that there's a skip in the chain of transmission. The Hanafis accept the mursal. So they accept it is that whoever of you laughed out loud, let them make wudu again, and there's no exiting of filth here. It's considered to be a punishment, punitive. That's a vile thing to do in prayer, to laugh out loud. Prayer is about humbling oneself and reverence. The ninth thing that breaks wudu is intimate contact between a man and a woman, such that the private parts touch directly in a state of arousal, without a barrier. In that situation, it is likely that something is on the verge of coming out, like pre-sexual fluids, but because there's actual direct skin-to-skin contact, one may not notice it. Right? So it's a place of caution. And this is the position of Abu Hanifa. The qiyas, legal reason, would entail that this does not break wudu. Immediate legal reason. But Imam Abu Hanifa exercised a characteristic principle of his legal reasoning, which is called istihsan, legal preference. Right? Which is to leave the more obvious line of reasoning for less obvious line of reasoning because of preponderating factors. It's called istihsan, legal choice or legal preference. So the primary line of legal reasoning would are you sure something came out? No. What is the assumption? The assumption would be purity. Therefore, you assume purity. And that nothing came out. Wudu is not nullified. However, Imam Abu Hanifa left that primary line of legal reasoning for a secondary line of legal reasoning that is less obvious but preponderates because of secondary factors, which is that this is a situation where something is very likely to come out. And because skin-to-skin contact took place, this is without intercourse, because intercourse requires ghusl to begin with. The skin-to-skin contact of the private parts in a state of arousal, something very likely would have come out, and it's easy to miss. So this is a place of required caution, because several high likelihoods come together, so it's as if you can be pretty sure that something would have come out. Right? So this is called legal preference, istihsan. Imam Shafi'i did not like the exercise of legal preference, and he wrote actually a whole treatise against it. But This is one of the sources of tremendous strength in the Hanafi school. And he debated his own teacher, Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, student of Imam Abu Hanifa. Imam Shafi'i debated him. And a lot of their debates revolved around this point on legal preference. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Now, we mentioned that other matters, touching the private parts does not require wudu. Touching the opposite sex does not require wudu. Touching the private parts, meaning with skin-to-skin contact. This would arise because, a few reasons. One is that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was not uncommon for people to go to sleep without their clothes on, under a bed sheet. Which is why there's hadiths about let no two adult men go to sleep under the same sheet. Right? And likewise with respect to women. And that applies if both are naked under the sheet. If they're both clothed, it's fine. Okay? So one of my friends learned that, and actually the Shafi'is mentioned, it is from the sunnah to go to sleep unclothed. And you'd go tell, you go visit something very interesting I discovered, Shaykh. He mentions Hashit al-Sharqawi in Shafi'i fiqh, that it is from it is sunnah. I try to explain him, it is from the sunnah. It's something established in the prophetic times, not that there's no encouragement of the Prophet ﷺ that go to sleep naked, right? But it is there. So if someone feels really hot in the summer, you have an alternative. As long as you keep your sheet on you, and your state is such that if someone came in upon you, you would be, you wouldn't be uncovered, right? So don't embarrass yourself in front of family or children or anything, right? But it has, it has basis, right? This is why. So that's why private parts could get touched. As a result, and also they had slits on the side of their clothes, and they could end up touching their private parts. So this does not require wudu. The hadiths that indicate it are for washing the private parts. Touching the opposite sex, of course, someone unrelated to you, skin-to-skin contact is not permissible. It is not permissible. There's a sound hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said that for one of you to be poked by a burning, for one of you to be poked by or touched by a burning hot iron rod is less harmful for you than to touch someone of the opposite sex who's unrelated to you. And it was from the custom of the Arabs that people would shake hands, including men and women. And there's at least a dozen clearly documented occasions. There's others that are implicitly where there's occasion for the Prophet ﷺ to shake someone's hand of the opposite sex, and he did not. Right? So once a group of women came, at the house of one of his wives, stretched out her hand, and he asked, "Whose hand is that?" "La usafihu nisa," because I don't shake the hands of unrelated women. When time came to pledge allegiance, he did not shake hands, even when it was extended, but rather he did it in a number of different ways. And there's a whole number of hadiths related to that, which is why the position of all four schools of Sunni Islam is that it is not permitted to shake hands with someone of the opposite sex. How do you get around it? That's a separate matter, but one who wants to does so, right? The simplest way is to stand behind our brethren from the people of the book. Just like Orthodox people of the Jewish faith, we don't shake hands, and no one's gonna object to anything that they do. So just stand behind them, and you'll. There's many other ways. If you have a job interview, tell them in advance, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يَتَقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. Whoever is mindful of Allah, Allah will grant them openings. Right? Allah will grant them openings. And it's in many areas it's becoming increasingly known that religious Muslims don't shake hands, and it's not a big deal. And the most important thing, the Prophet ﷺ, you can't reach everyone with your wealth or your status or your influence, but you can reach everyone. You can touch everyone with good character. If you're being nice when you begin the encounter, if you're smiling, you're being nice, you're being, respectful, positive, they really don't care. And there's 101 reasons, right? People blame it on the weather that you may be slightly, if you need to sniff a couple of times before you have the encounter. No one wants to shake hands with a sick person anyways, right? Or cough in your hand, right? Just before, figure it out. When there's a will, there's a way. There's many ways. We also talked about doubts, that the basis of purification is ease, right? And the basis of anything, they say, is your operational certainty, right? And certainty is not lifted by doubts. So you ignore all doubts and possibilities. Could it have? Doesn't matter. You assume that it wasn't. So you ignore doubts and possibilities. Now, when you have a doubt, isn't it caution to just make wudu again? Isn't it just caution to make wudu again anyways? The answer would be no. And this is an important principle. Caution is not doing what's more difficult. Right? Caution, one of the most brilliant definitions of caution was given by Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, who said that caution is to do that which is more likely to be more. That is caution. Caution is to do that which is more likely to be pleasing to Allah. Or if there's two choices, both are good, caution is to do what's more likely to be more pleasing to Allah. Often that would be to do what's stricter or more careful, quote unquote. But not always. Sometimes caution is in leaving what's stricter. One of the reasons you leave what's stricter is that the basis of caution is to follow the sunnah. The first step of caution is to follow the sunnah. Now, are you born with intuitive knowledge of the sunnah? No. So the first step of caution, you want to be careful about anything, the first thing you have to know is, okay, I need to learn what is the sunnah of this. So I know the basic halal and haram, but what is the sunnah regarding this? So what do? You find out the sunnah. The sunnah is, you find out the sunnah through knowledge. In matters that relate to, there's the broad virtues that you can go directly, right? What are the, if you want to know what are the sunnahs of being a good husband, right? Open a book of hadith, it tells you be kind, caring, etc. You don't need to go to someone to ask, define being caring for me. In the general case, now you want to know some particular situation, let's say, I have a friend whose wife has some really difficult emotional states every once in a while. She's self-employed. Every once in a while, she decides, I'm not feeling well. And no, the doctors don't know anything. Why? Home, stay in bed till 1 or 2 p.m. So my friend actually has special arrangements with work where he'll stay with her. And that's different. So there you want to know, okay, what does it mean to care for my wife or my husband in some extraordinary situation? With the general virtues, just go directly to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But matters of subtlety, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of remembrance if you know not. So if you want to be careful about something, you begin with knowledge. That what are the limits regarding this? Number 2, what is the sunnah regarding this? Because what is caution? Caution is to do that which is more likely to be pleasing to Allah. So it begins with sound application of the sunnah. Right? It begins with sound application of sunnah. Right? So you act according to not beyond that. Things that don't accord with what is praiseworthy by the standards of knowledge, that's considered to be misgivings, considered to be doubts, is considered to be mere possibilities, conjecture. And misgivings, doubts, possibilities, conjectures, none of those are considered to be from praiseworthy caution. Rather, caution is acting in accordance with knowledge and doing what is better by the standards of sound understanding of prophetic guidance. So that's why they say there is no caution without knowledge. Rather, you see people who become religious, but they don't learn, they make themselves and others miserable when they don't learn properly. So they go to someone's, actually I joke with my sister every time I go to her house, when she has cakes, I ask her, is that cake halal? She said, oh no. It was a little joke we have, right? Because she's had that experience several times. A cake for someone, you invite people over, someone, and it used to happen before, alhamdulillah, most of our circles of friends have become either too old to care or, too in the know to do bizarre things, but we've done our bizarre things in our times. So, that if you look at that, you go to someone's house, you want to be careful because you realize that there's, in desserts, etc., they can be haram ingredients. You want to be cautious. So in public you ask Sister Zubaydah, is that cake halal? Is that from caution? Because you don't want to eat the haram. Why isn't it from caution? Because what is caution? What is caution? That which is more likely to be pleasing to Allah. So by asking someone religious, is that halal, in front of others, what have you just done? You've embarrassed someone. Right? You've questioned their religious concern. What else have you done? You've disrespected your host. Right? Sorry? Yeah, you've given other people reasons for misgivings. Someone might say, oh, what about the meat we just had? Right? Right? And people will start and all kind, and respecting others is obligatory. Respecting others is obligatory. Right? It's one of the central aims of the Sharia is preservation of honor. Right? So respecting others is obligatory. Having a good opinion of others is obligatory. Doubting others, what's the ruling? Doubting others is prohibited. Right? Having good opinion is obligatory. So you have to uphold that. Doubting others is uprightness is prohibited. So, and you've vitiated all these, right? Because you don't leave the obligatory for the recommended. So if you want to be cautious, you know a lot of people, let's say, like glazed desserts. Glazed desserts, sorry, this new unicity thing is quite annoying. Because even my iPad rings when my phone rings. Okay. Blames the successors to see if so if you wanted to be cautious about not having some glazed, the glazing may have gelatin, what would you do? What do you do? At someone else's house, for example, what do you do? What would you do? Don't eat it. You can even make up a half-truth. Say, I'm not really hungry, meaning I'm not at the level of hunger that would make eating obligatory. Right? Or say, I'm full, meaning I'm full enough. Right? I had more than a few morsels to keep my back straight, like the hadith that, that's sufficient. Or you had more than a third, which is the dispensation. Right? So that's better to do than to question someone. Now if you really wanted to find, you go to someone's house and you're not sure whether they get what kind of meat they get. So what you could either ask beforehand, right? Tell them that we only eat hand slaughtered meat. You tell them beforehand, or bring your own. That's your sunnah. Like you go to someone's house, take some food, or just say, well, just avoid eating meat. Nothing wrong with not eating meat every day. Said, well, have strong reason to doubt, just say, you're not sure about the chicken, because you avoid certain types of chicken. So just say, I'm on a particular diet, which is I don't eat. Tell them what the diet is, but that's, so there's ways to exercise caution, right? There's ways to exercise caution, and there's ways not to exercise caution. Right? And from the ways not to exercise caution, but that doesn't mean that if something requires caution, that you don't exercise it. Right? You don't exercise it, right? When there is reasonable doubt. So there's reasons, right? They don't. But this is an important principle that we just wanted to emphasize a little more. You run into your cousin. Sometimes you run into your cousin. Now, you don't know anything about them. Do you assume that they pray 5 times a day or not? Yes. Any person, you assume soundness and uprightness. Now, but what if they don't? Right? Firstly, you're not God's policeman on earth. But secondly, there's a difference between having good opinion of someone and being careful, or having concern, right, for good. So let's say your family, your extended cousins are not, let's say your cousins who live in South Dakota, they're not religious. You've heard that. But when one of them comes, what do you assume? You assume uprightness, because you assume soundness. You avoid having a good opinion of others is obligatory. Having doubts about others is prohibited. And you don't leave those that operating assumption for possibilities. But that does not preclude having sincere concern, and does not preclude having caution, when caution is called for. But you exercise it in a manner that upholds good opinion of them and upholds respect of them. Okay? And that does not fall into following doubts or prying into someone's private affairs, for example. Any questions here before we continue? Go ahead.
How do you exercise caution when someone's wiping over their socks?
How do you exercise caution when someone is wiping over their socks? Firstly, don't look. Is there any sunnah that you're aware of that tells you that when someone else is making wudu, look at them? Don't. Especially, let's say you go to university, you're at university. There's all kinds of people around, and there's young, enthusiastic, activist brother will be leading the prayer. Now, he's making wudu. Do you need to look at him making wudu? Why are you looking? This religion is easy. The Prophet said, "Inna hadha dina yusr." This religion is easy. No one وَلَنْ يُشَادَّ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ. No one makes the religion difficult except that it will overwhelm them. Is there any religious encouragement? This is like caution. What is caution? To act on the basis of knowledge. So you want to be careful about that. You don't know. Is it religiously praiseworthy for me to look at someone making wudu? No. Caution isn't doing whatever feels stricter or more careful. That's a type of neurosis. Right? Religion, deen, they say, ad-deen ittiba'u sayyid al-mursaleen. Right? Religion is following the Prophet ﷺ. In tuti'uhu tahtadu. If you follow him, you will be guided. There's nothing in the sunnah that says someone making wudu, look at them. Unless you're in a situation, you're a teacher and they're a student of yours and you want to teach them or something and the situation is appropriate, but that's a separate matter. But in other than that, you assume validity and you overlook. Someone making wudu, don't look, make yourself not look, especially in situations where there's ignorance. You want to deal with ignorance, you deal with the cause, not its manifestations. If you're worried, there's a lot of people who don't know about knowledge on campus, for example, whatever. Facilitate the starting of a seeker, so I was typing seeker. Like start a study circle in your campus. Find someone who can teach the basics, or be the person who can teach the basics. Get permission from your teachers, ask permission to do this, and do that. That is caution. Right? And that spreads greater benefit. Right? If they're on, inshallah they'll be under Allah's mercy. But if you stare at someone and you know they didn't wash their arms properly, now you've made religion difficult for yourself. You made it difficult for others. Right? So don't. Right? And there's ways of exercising caution. Right? Sayyidina al-Hasan and Sayyidina al-Hussein, it mentioned they saw this older man who was making wudu terribly badly. Now, most of us, if you saw someone make wudu terribly, we'd say, what are you doing? What's this wrong? What did they do? They said, addressing with terms of respect, like, uncle, my brother and I, we disagree which of us makes wudu better. So could you judge between us, please? And they both made wudu. I said, which one made wudu more properly? And the man realized that he was making a lot of mistakes. They said, I bear witness that you are truly, the grandchildren of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So, because it's not just about, because there's a way to exercise caution. There's a way to correct. Right? And that's important. So if one wants to be cautious, so someone's wiping over their socks. Firstly, someone begins wiping, don't look. You're not responsible for it. But then, if they're wiping over socks, first, you're not responsible for their socks, but what do you assume about their socks? That they're valid to wipe over. And you don't have to investigate. Say, could you show me your socks? Right? You assume that they're, especially on things that become prevalent problems, then they say, إِذَا عَمَّتِ الْبَلْوَى, right? If something becomes a widespread issue. And actually, a lot of socks are valid to wipe over, because the condition in the Hanafi school for wiping over socks is that they cover the area, that they not be, and that they be thick and sturdy. The two critical conditions is that they be thick and sturdy. Thickness is that they're not so thin that you can see through them from a normal distance. Right? And number two, the second consideration of thickness is that if you took a dripping wet hand and wiped over it, the water wouldn't go to the feet immediately. أن يمنع نفوذ الماء عند المسح, that they prevent water reaching the skin at wiping. Right? If the water reaches a little while later, it does not affect. That's thick. And they be sturdy. Sturdy means that the sign of sturdiness is that if you were to walk extensively in them, and at the time, when they're traveling, if they stopped somewhere, then they had to pitch the tents, gather the water, collect firewood, and all these things. So I said extensive walking would be considered being able to walk up to 3 miles. 3 miles being like 5 and a bit kilometers. And most socks that are in the market are sturdy enough to be able to walk extensively in them. Contrary to the socks in much of the Muslim world. We have a Syrian here. Can you walk extensively in the typical Syrian socks? Absolutely not. And that's why you buy socks like in bags of socks. It's shameful. Right? It's shameful. Right? But here, actually, we've done extensive tests. Every time if you say you're welcome to challenge me on this, do it. Get together at Fajr time, before it gets too cold, and walk 3 miles. Right? Turn on your GPS on your smartphone and keep track of how far you're walking. And one day Imam Zaid came over breakfast at this Deen Intensive. He said, something really strange happened after Fajr. Imam Zaid was going for his morning walk, and there's a troop of sisters walking. Imam Zaid lowered his gaze and said, they're all not wearing shoes. And they're all actually, some of them were deliberately walking off the path. And the path was like wide enough for them to walk on it. And some were walking on the path. And after a while they switched. He said, it's really strange. So I said, I knew it must be. Did you get them up to this? I said, yes, Sid. And they reported back, they walk much more than 3 miles. I've never walked 3 miles in socks. I'd never do something so foolish. But I've had it tested many times, and a rigorous friend of mine tested it very scientifically. I just did it more anecdotally. He ran like, and pretty much all socks in the market fulfill those conditions. Fulfill the condition of sturdiness. Unless you get some like a $1 for a dozen socks or something. They have to be thick enough to wipe over and not so thin that you can see through them. So basically, in winter, if you wear thick socks, you can wipe over them. Right? You want to wipe over socks, get thick, good quality socks, and that's fine. And you can actually there's summer socks that are thick enough. Like you can have thick cotton socks instead of the thin cotton socks. And that's it. Caution entails washing your feet. You want to be cautious, you can wash your feet. You want to be cautious, get actual khufs. You want to be cautious, because there's some scholars that may disagree with this, get socks. IslamicOutfitters.com online sells them. They sent me like half a dozen pairs. I'm kind of embarrassed because I want to tell them you don't need these anyways, but that's a separate matter. So that's what caution is. That caution isn't to be strict with others. Caution is to know how to act. When you don't know, what do? You don't correct others. But you assume and you find out. Right? You find out. But when it has to do with dealing with others, you err on the side of respect and good opinion. You err on the side of respect and good opinion. And this is a very important in dealing, right? So if you see that, you just assume that the socks are valid to wipe on, and you don't look further. The same thing. Is it from caution, once you wash your arms, is it from caution to look to make sure the water has reached? Is it from caution? No. And if you're not sure, that's why knowledge is beneficial. So, okay, go back to knowledge. What I've learned, is it fard to look? No, if it was fard, it would have been mentioned. Even if you studied just the basic, so it's pretty much certainly not fard, right? Because if it's obligatory to look after you're washed, they would have said it. Is it an emphasized sunnah? No. Is it recommended? Maybe. So what do? You don't look, but rather go find out. Go find out. Because if you start asking what's going to happen, you're going to get other doubts. Did I wipe my head after wudu? During wudu. Now if you're walking to prayer and you have this doubt, did I wipe my head? What do you assume? Yes, you did. You always assume validity, unless you're sure. Should you check, is there moisture? No. You stick with the assumption, you don't do this kind of checking. Actually, I caught a friend of mine, and when people follow doubts, they do the most bizarre things. I kid you not. I was overseas, I saw a friend of mine, a PhD candidate in some difficult subject, I don't even understand what it is. He stopped in the street and he was looking into his trousers. Because he wanted to make sure that nothing came out after he made wudu. Now that's like public exposure. Alhamdulillah, no one could see it. I looked away, I told him, what are you doing? He said, just making sure nothing came out before I go to the masjid. Right? There's people who have this. When you start following doubt, it becomes waswasa. Right? You become. It's not just you are a person who's besotten by doubts. You become muwaswas. Right? And it's a common mispronunciation. The Arabs typically say muwaswis, but it's muwaswas. Because they're one who's getting misgivings. Because it's shaitan who gives misgivings. And following these doubts is not from the sunnah. Why? Because what is the sunnah to deal with doubts? Is to ignore them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran closes with what? With seeking refuge from waswasa. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ إِلَهِ النَّاسِ مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ. Right? You seek refuge through many levels of seeking refuge from what? مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ. From the harms of the slinking whisperer of doubts. الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس, who places doubts and misgivings, waswasa, in the hearts of people. من الجنة والناس, of jinns and, right? So it is against the command of Allah, the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, to listen to doubts. It is not from caution. Whether this has to do with dealing with others and say, oh, what if this, what if that? You don't listen to it. When it comes to personal matters of purity, etc. Also in judging people. One of the important things in judging people is you don't listen to doubts. Right? And this with media. This is an important concept because it has many life implications. Right? If you're not called upon to judge in a matter, don't. Right? It's safer not to judge and to stick to the general principles. So we have some Canadian guy who's now referred to by their ethnicity too, because they're up in arms. If he committed a crime, let the court system decide. Are you a judge? No. Are you going to be there as an expert witness? No. Right? Reading about it, is it of your personal benefit? Is it something you need to seek the good of the next life? No. Is it something you need to seek the good of this life? No. So stick to the general principles, that if someone has done wrong, we have a legal system that should take care of it. We should stick to the fact that abuse, wrongdoing, this, that, the other, are wrong. Right? And that's true. Right? Did it happen in this case? Say, you shouldn't judge. Right? But stand for justice. That if anyone was wronged, then that wrong should be redressed. There should be justice. There should be fairness. But do not judge. And going into conjecture on these matters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, إِنَّ بَعْضَ الظَّنِّ إِثْمٍ, that most suspicion is sinful, even if it is correct. Even if it is correct. Circumstantial evidence is not sufficient. One person's word against another is not sufficient as proof in court, and it's not sufficient in proof in you judging someone. So don't. Right? Honor is sacred, which doesn't mean that they can get away with whatever wrong they do. If they did wrong, it should be dealt with. Right? Whether legally or through arbitration, adjudication, arbitration, mediation, at whatever level of redress, should be redressed. So what should you stand for? For the general principles of upholding good and preventing or redressing wrong. Right? And that applies to the principles of doubt. That a whole bunch of doubt added together does not make a sound judgment. Okay? And that applies also to reading about celebrities and what they're doing and so did this and that. These are all following ill opinion and doubts, and that is sinful. So one should be very, very careful. And people who do that, you ask, what's the state of your heart after you follow that kind of stuff? You'll find your heart is darkened and clouded, and there's no good. Right? So don't pursue such matters. Any questions here? Okay, go ahead.
With regards to filth exiting from the private parts, what is considered filthy?
What is considered filthy? Basically, anything that exits from the private parts is assumed to be filthy. Right? Anything that exits from the private parts is assumed to be filthy. There's exceptional cases. Right? The most common exceptional case is vaginal discharge. And the sign of it be a vaginal discharge is when clear is not impure and does not break wudu. Because vaginal discharge is not itself filthy because it's clear. It does not have the signs of filth itself, and its assumed source is the vagina, which is not a place of filth. Right? Filth originates from beyond there. Right? So, and how do you know? I mean, you're not supposed to, there's no expectation of making scientific studies on yourself. So an outward sign is taken. If it's clear at the time of exiting, it's considered to be pure, because its source is considered to be vaginal, which is not a place. But if it's unclear, then it is assumed to be from beyond the vagina. So even if it's not blood or or the like, it being unclear, it would mean that it's either affected by filth or it passed by where filth passes by. So that's considered. So the outward sign is taken. So clear vaginal discharge is neither filthy nor breaks wudu, but any other discharge does. If a worm comes out from front or rear private part, does that break wudu? Yeah. Yes. Even if it goes back in right away. Right? So, little wormy, right? Guillermo the worm comes out, sticks his head out, says, "This looks like a dangerous place." Goes back in. Just by coming out, it breaks. Yeah. Well, when would it break wudu? When it exited, meaning appeared on the surface, even if it didn't move beyond, right? Now, why is the worm filthy? No. So if the worm came out, you washed the worm, and it wiggled and it fell into your lota, what you make istinja with. Could you take that out and leave that for the next person? Yes. Why? Because it's not assumed to be filthy. Right? The worm itself is not filthy. The worm is considered filthy because it passed by the place of filth. So you could assume that there's filth on it, but it's not the worm that is filthy, it's because it passed through the place of filth, so it's likely to have filth on it. Right? So if the worm itself fell into a bucket of water upon exiting, the fuqaha differ what would happen to that bucket of water. Most would say that you would assume that it has filth on it, even if not evident. And there's some difference of opinion. So a worm comes out, no evident filth, fell into a small bucket of water. Is the bucket filthy? Yes. But if you wash the worm and then put it in the bucket of water, it would be. Anything else that exits from the private parts? Sensations should be ignored. Right? Especially if you have waswasa, and I've tested this on people extensively, right? Like some people get these doubts that I made wudu, now I felt that something came out. You assume that nothing until you're sure that something came out, right? Because after using cold water on your organs, you'll have all kinds of weird sensations. I asked someone who knows about science, they said there are all kinds of funny things happening with the nerves in that area, right? And there's contractions and expansions and this and that taking place. Ignore sensations. The sunnah is, if you have doubts after relieving yourself, you do the sunnah related to cleaning yourself. After you do that, if you have doubts, take a little bit of water, sprinkle it on your private. If you have any sensations or doubts, attribute it to that moistening of the area. But you ignore it. It is contrary to the sunnah, after you've done the sunnah, to further. It is contrary to the sunnah to investigate further. Go ahead.
So if air falls in a small amount of water, it won't slip impure. If air flood and it falls in
Air? Hair? No.
because of the bulb, which is
Okay.
Concerning when one is wearing socks after they make wudu, how long is that wudu valid?
Yeah. So, wiping over what they call wiping over foot gear, we do not get into it, but you can wipe over valid foot gear, that which covers the foot validly, like a khuf or socks that take the ruling of khufs, for 24 hours if you're resident, from the time of the first loss of wudu with them on in a state of ritual purity, and for the traveler 72 hours, 3 days, from the first invalidation of wudu after having put them on in a state of purity. And you can see the details in Ascent to Felicity or the like of it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So next class we're going to look at prayer, beginning with the virtues of prayer. We're going to look at the conditions, integrals, and necessary acts of prayer. Today we expanded somewhat on the principles of certainty and doubt because these are very important. Right? That the basis in anything is validity and soundness. Right? And you assume validity and soundness, this is your operating assumption. Certainty is not lifted by doubts. Right? Right? Rather, the sunnah with doubts is to ignore them and not to investigate them. Caution is acting in accordance with knowledge and in accordance with what is praiseworthy according to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in the way delineated. So you want caution in wudu, find out what are ways to be careful in wudu. Right? So apply knowledge to those doubts, but the doubts themselves you ignore. And saying just in case is not caution. Well, just in case, I'll avoid that. Rather, you assume validity. Right? You assume validity. And when unsure, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا شِفَاءُ الْعَيِّ السُّؤَالِ. The only cure for confusion is to ask. Right? And that's one of the ways that people impose a lot of hardship on them. They make assumptions. They make things very difficult for themselves, sometimes very difficult for others. So for example, your child vomited. I know people who do this, who have done this, who'd grab the child and wash out their mouth completely. It's not easy. A child vomited, they're not like in a happy state. Washing out a child's mouth completely, especially a baby, is not easy. Especially if they're vomiting. What's the problem there? Where did you read that you have to do this? Right? So what is caution? Is to do that which is more likely to be pleasing to Allah. Caution is acting in accordance with what is praiseworthy by the standards of knowledge. And if you don't know, don't make assumptions. Right? That's why you study what you need to study. When you're not sure, find out before you act. Wash the child's mouth anyways, even if you had to, which you don't. You could delay washing it, right? So, other things like that as well.
Shaykh, about nullifier 7, drunkenness. When discussing, you mentioned something about loss of function, loss of bodily function that often happens in total drunkenness. So, if someone is high on some other kind of intoxicant, like a weed or something like that, marijuana, and they're not experiencing or they're not observed loss of bodily function, would that not be a nullifier?
Yeah, I mean, if they enter into a state that would be considered sukr, right? That they've lost. So, drunkenness is akin to loss of sanity, right? Because you lose full mental, you lose, mental capacity that you're no longer able to judge right. If you were given directions, you would not be able. Someone said you go right and then left, you wouldn't know what was said to you, right? So you ask, where are you? They said, I don't know, right? Like that state of confusion. So someone was high on drugs. When it's considered when they've lost their rational capacity, that would be akin to drunkenness. But being slightly drunk, that someone just slurring their speech, for example, or the like, without losing capacity, that would be loss of mental capacity, but not be bereft of mental capacity, so that wouldn't invalidate. There's a whole number of answers. There's a reader actually on Seekers, it's a reader on misgivings and doubts. Inshallah, we'll put that under the resources for this class. And it's good to go through that. It has a lot of these principles that we illustrated and a number of questions that arise related to that.
If you have a wound that's bleeding and it's bleeding a lot and it won't stop, is it better to wait for it to stop bleeding, or is it something else?
Okay, so if you have a wound that's bleeding and it won't stop, what do you do? Well, you can wait for it to stop, but you can also prevent it from flowing. Right? Because if the blood wanted to come but you stopped it, it won't come out. Right? So you put a bandage for, you wash away the filth from the area. You put a bandage on. If you put a bandage on, firmly, right? Compression typically avoids flow. If you've ever done first aid, they'll tell ice. Like one of the things you're supposed to do is compression. You put a little pressure on the area. If the cut's not severe, it'll stop blood flow. And you can assume that if you put a bandage on, and it's just regular flow, it's not like gushing out, and it's not clear. If you put if you wash away the area, so you've washed away the filth that's already there, and you put a bandage on, what do you assume? That it's stopped blood coming out. Right? You assume that, unless it's obviously to the contrary. Ignore doubts. You go make wudu, right? And you assume that no blood's coming out. Now, after the fact, so let's say you did that. After prayer, should you check if anything came out? No. Right? Because you did what you're expected to. You put a bandage, you compress it, you can assume that. Just to be careful, that's not praiseworthy. Now, let's say you finish prayer and handshaking sister came and she gave a bone-crunching handshake, and when she withdrew, this weird ring that she has plucked away your bandage right after the prayer. So the bandage opened up and there's a dot of blood. There's a circle of blood. What do you assume about that blood? Did it break wudu? Firstly, the first thing, you just ignore it. Do you have to look at the bandage? No. Unless you're sure that blood can, you don't really have to. But if you notice that there's blood on it, you assume that it's a little, that it didn't flow. But let's say it's a lot. What do you assume after the prayer? You assume that it happened after the prayer. Because you assume validity. So if you have to affirm that it wasn't valid, unless it's clearly to the contrary, but it wouldn't have been, because it was clearly to the contrary, it would have been clear to you when you prayed. Right? So if you notice after the prayer, you assume that it was there after the prayer. Let's say you finish praying, and the person next to you had eaten like garlic eggs for breakfast or something, so you put your hand on your mouth and you notice there's blood coming from your nose right after the prayer. So after the prayer, you say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, you say, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. And you notice there's blood. What do you assume? When did the blood come out? After the prayer, even if it's right after the prayer. Because unless it's obvious to the contrary, that some friend of yours punched you in the nose before you prayed and then you prayed, then if it's obvious. But if you have doubts, you ignore likelihood as well. Okay, so we'll stop there. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira.